Death at Bishop's Keep, Chapter 32. But answer came there none. Sir Walter Scott, The Bridal of Triermain. It was raining in a drizzly, half-hearted fashion when Charles got back on his horse after leaving Mrs. Farnsworth's house on Keenan Street. If the lady had any answers, she had not imparted them to him. But perhaps there was another way to get to the bottom of the affair. He rode toward the village of Dedham, 3 miles to the north of Marston Manor, along the River Stour. Charles remembered Dedham quite well from the days of his youth. It was a market town for the hamlet of East Berkholt, where he had spent summers that he still recalled with joy and wonder, visiting his grandparents and wandering the wooded hills and sweet shallow vales. Dedham lay on the south side of the river, whose lush green banks sloped into deep water, verges fringed with willow and hawthorn, and populated by choirs of songbirds. Barges moved slowly westward on the river, and from the harbour at Manningtree, through locks at Flatford and Dedham and Stratford St. Mary. Dedham's High Street ran east and west along one side of a small square. On the northeast cumber stood the Marlborough Head, half-timbered building of respectable vintage that had served as a wool market in the 15th century, an apothecary in the 7th century, and finally, after 1704 and the Battle of Blenheim, as an inn named for the first Duke of Marlborough. It had from time to time offered the young Charles a place to warm himself and eat hot pork pie while waiting for his grandfather to complete his business. Across High Street stood the Brick Grammar School, a fine Georgian building with calm facade and a stately demeanour. And on the corner opposite stood the pride of the village, the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, its tower 4 square and commanding height, founded on the wealth of the woolen industry and raised before King Henry's bold interference in the divine order of things. The walls were faced with stone from Cape Cairn, and local knapped flint had been used to construct the tower. The buttresses were outlined heavily by large quoins of dressed stone, and in the plinth of the tower was an arrangement of quatrefoil shields alternating with crowns. It was altogether an impressive church, the cornerstone of village life. The vicarage was much less picturesquely impressive, designed not to celebrate the spirit, but to answer the needs of the body for shelter and for comfort. It stood beside the church, a solid, tidy brick residence with a slate roof, a respectable number of chimney pots, and green shutters. A carriage waited in the street, the Macintoshed driver hunched over his reins, clearly unhappy about the wet. As Charles rode up, a woman in a fur hat came out of the front door, her mouth set, her face marked by evident distress. She climbed into the carriage and drove off. In the front hallway, Charles' damp coat was taken by the solicitous housekeeper, and he was shown into a small dark parlour warmed by a brisk fire. A few moments later, Vicar Talbot appeared, a troubled look on his lined face and his lion's mane of white hair dishevelled, as if his pastoral shoulders still bore the burden left behind by his just-departed parishioner. The vicar was followed by the housekeeper with the tea tray, and the next few moments were spent in the business of pouring and passing. By the time Charles was settled in his overstuffed chair by the fire, teacup and muffin plate on the table beside, the vicar's ruffled hair and troubled expression seemed somewhat soothed. "Well, Sir Charles," he said, relaxing in the chair opposite, "what brings you out on such a dismal day?" "A question or two," Charles said, "concerning the man whose body was found in the Colchester digs." The vicar raised an eyebrow. "Ah, yes," he said, filling his pipe with tobacco. "And what has been discovered thus far about this unfortunate gentleman?" "Very little," Charles admitted. "We have the nationality, French, and a name, Monsieur Armand, although whether either are precisely correct is difficult to say." "We?" the vicar asked. "That is, you and—" "The police, of course," Charles said. "Inspector Wainwright refuses to bring the Yard into a matter that clearly requires more resources than he has. I'm doing what I can, which I fear is deuced little." "To be sure," the vicar replied. He sipped his tea. "Nothing else has been discovered." "Well, the carriage he hired, in which I found a fingerprint. Unfortunately, the victim has already been buried, so I cannot discover whether it is his or whether the fingerprint belongs to someone else. If a suspect is found, I shall certainly attempt to take his print to look for a match. And something else," he added casually. "A bit of feather. Pavo cristatus." The vicar glanced up sharply, then went back to his pipe. Watching, Charles thought he saw an intensification of the troubled look the old man had worn before he came into the room. "On the carriage, did you?" he remarked, propping his feet on the chintz-covered stool in front of him. "That took a bit of luck. Or deft detecting." Charles nodded. "The peacock feather, I've been told, is the insignia of the Order of the Golden Dawn." The vicar puffed calmly on his pipe. "Quite so," he replied, "but peacock feathers have been the rage for some years now. Everybody has them, even I." He gestured at a ceramic vase of dried grass fronds and peacock feathers in the corner. "Of course," Charles said thoughtfully. "Still, it is a clue, and there are bloody few of them in this affair." He paused. "You're a member of the Order, if I understood you correctly the other evening." "I am." His reply was slow, almost reluctant. Charles gave the other man an inquiring glance. When they talked previously, the vicar had seemed impressed with the Order, and even recommended it. Had something occurred to change his view? He spoke quietly. "I wonder, sir, if you would oblige me by telling me something of it." The vicar made a small grimace and shifted in his chair. "What do you want to know?" "Well, something of its history, perhaps." "Well then," the vicar said, as if resigned, "I first heard of it 6 years ago at a meeting of the Metropolitan College of the Society of the Rosicrucians. Wynne Westcott spoke of it. He is a coroner of London, then and now a man of utterly impeccable repute." He shook his head slightly. There was in his face a kind of regretful disappointment, as if he were speaking of someone about whom he had held a mistakenly elevated opinion and could scarcely believe that he had been in error. He came back to himself and began to speak again. "Dr. Westcott invited me to a meeting of the temple, the Isis Urania Temple, as it was called, newly established in London. I was delighted to be asked to enter as a neophyte." A tone of wry irony colored his words. "A neophyte indeed. I fear I had much to learn, although I thought at the time I knew quite a lot." "Neophyte is a rank of entry." "Yes. Members progress through various ranks, as do the Freemasons. With the proper study and the passing of certain tests, I advanced through the grades of the outer order, neophyte, zelator, theoricus, practicus, and philosophus, and thence to the second order, where I now stand at 6th grade and adeptus major." "It sounds as if there is much effort involved in this work," Charles remarked. "I have always been interested in the magical arts and count the time as study of little consequence." The vicar's mouth set in a firm, fixed line, and bitterness crept into his tone. "I've prided myself on my commitment to scientific inquiry into the occult, not out of superstitious credulousness, but on the firm foundation of objective science. To learn now that I may have been—" He bit off his sentence. "I may have been what, sir?" The vicar straightened. "I think, Sir Charles, that I have said as much as I am able, more perhaps than I should have done. The Golden Dawn is, after all, a secret society, and its practices must remain confidential." Charles took a different tack. "How long has Mrs. Farnsworth been a member of the Order?" The vicar's gaze went back to the fire. "Ah, yes, Mrs. Farnsworth." He puffed on his pipe. A wreath of smoke rose over his head. "I first encountered the lady in the Isis Urania Temple, an actress, then Florence Faber. Have you met?" "This morning," Charles said. "I called on her." The vicar nodded. "Her stage career, it appears, came to something of an abrupt conclusion. She apparently refused to honor a contract which angered the play's producers. Subsequently, a larger difficulty arose over a substantial sum of money she is said to have, borrowed." He paused. "I have not inquired into the details, you understand, but I gather that there were accusations on both sides, and that the matter was concluded without litigation only on the condition that her departure from London's stage was to be permanent." "In other words," Charles said, "she has been blacklisted." "So it would seem. She married an admirer, a Colchester merchant who was said to have made a substantial fortune in the railroad stock, but he died shortly after the honeymoon, leaving her to discover, with some understandable shock, I dare say, that the expected fortune had melted into a sea of debts. She only just managed to keep the house in Keenan Street from going out on the auctioneer's block." "How does she support herself then?" By the contributions of the wealthier members of the temple, they are glad to give generously toward the establishment of the order in Colchester. Mrs. Farnsworth has been energetic in seeing to its expansion, and the membership here now exceeds that in Edinburgh, Bradford, and Paris combined. She is also supported because she is a friend of Westcott's," he added. There was a touch of acid in his tone. In the view of the members, Westcott is a god. She does not plan to return to acting, then. On the contrary, she does, although not at present in London. Some friends of hers in Westcott, again, wealthy members of the temple, are working toward that end. She will play Rosalind in As You Like It when the Grand Theatre opens early next year. "You mentioned Paris," Charles said reflectively. "There is a Parisian temple, operated by someone named Mathers, I believe." The vicar pulled rapidly on his pipe. "Mathers, indeed. Mathers. Is he connected with the order here in England?" "He was," the vicar said. The pulling became so agitated that it turned into a spate of coughing. "Fancies himself an occultist," the vicar choked out. "Involved with the Kabbalah, astrology, the tarot, and eccentric with an exaggerated sense of his own importance, in my opinion, and a troublemaker. But no immediate connection with the British order." The vicar's knuckles widened around his pipe stem. The thought of Mathers seemed to waken some deep emotion in him, anger, perhaps even fear. "None, Sir Charles, that I am at liberty to discuss at this time." He pushed himself to the edge of the chair. "I have only partially answered your questions, and I am distressed to thrust you out once more into the wet, but I fear that my Sunday sermon is still in the state of disrepair and requires my active attentions. Do you mind?" "Of course not," Charles said, setting his cup on the table. "But before you go, perhaps—" He opened his portfolio. "Can you tell me if you recognize this man?" The vicar took the photograph. "Is this the murdered man?" he asked. A tick appeared in the corner of his eyes. "Yes," Charles said. The vicar handed back the photograph and stood, not meeting Charles' eyes. "I'm afraid I cannot help you," he said. Charles rose as well, hearing the evasion in the clergyman's words. There might be answers here, but for the moment, Vicar Talbot was keeping them to himself.